Welcome to A Growing Concern. We want to give a real shout out to the folks who were hanging from that bridge for a couple of days in that 100-degree heat. I think we even have a shot of them thanks to Frank Mahoney, if we can get that up. He was out there and he did some videotaping, and since I could not make it, there it is. Great shot. I'm right in the way. But other than that, we can let folks see what's going on there. I'm sure anybody that was watching their television saw this. Rachel Maddow talked about it for 15 minutes. It was all over the world. It was great. You know, they kept that thing at bay for a couple of days. And to me, the main thing was they got some media out of it. And them folks did a great job. Greenpeace came in, local people, the 350.org and Rising Tide jumped in, and they all worked together, and I'm sure that the Climate Action Coalition was working on that as well. So good job, everybody, and we hope that this can keep continuing, and we can finally convince Obama that drilling in that pristine area is really not a really good idea, and there needs to be energy put into sustainability, not into continuing feeding the greed machine of the oil companies. So we'll move on to what we're going to talk about tonight. I've got three guests. I just hope I can get it all right now. We have, I'll get my eyes on here. We have Roger Wendlick, and you're with the Lewis and Clark Heritage Foundation?
Lewis and Clark Trail Heritage Foundation.
Trail Heritage Foundation. Yes, all right, and then we also have Robert Quinn, who was with us a while back, and she was speaking, I forget who was with us, but she was speaking about stopping at Pembina propane terminal, and you stopped it, Barbara.
Yeah,
good job.
I did.
And also we have Roger Wendlick? No, Michael Carnosh.
Yep.
And you're with the Confederated Tribes?
Yep, Confederated Tribes of Grand
Ronde. All right. Well, there's a lot to talk about tonight. The reason that this whole show got started was because these folks are involved in an event that's happening on August 2nd at Cathedral Park. Unfortunately, they won't have that in the background, but we were hoping. But they're not going to have that in the background. But since I talked to Barbara first, we would just lead off talking about that, and then we can branch off because there's a lot to talk about with the Willamette River.
Sure. The Willamette River Revival is an event, one-day free community-based event that is open to everyone. The mission is to celebrate the lower Willamette River, and specifically between the confluence with the Columbia and the Fremont Bridge. And so its mission is also to connect citizens with the lower river as the commons. And we're going to celebrate the river, the riverfront, and also look at information about the upcoming cleanup, the imminent Superfund cleanup. So we're going to impart some information about the cleanup in a fun way, hopefully with some science demos. And we're going to have Roger as a storyteller talking about the Lewis and Clark expedition up the Willamette, and Michael Carnosh is going to represent the native viewpoint of the river, and maybe tell us a little bit about the tradition of the salmon bake. And the tribe is providing us with smoked salmon, so we're really lucky. It's complimentary, and like I say, everyone's invited, and it's going to be a big community celebration.
From what? 12 to 1, 12 to 7?
12 to 7 at night, and then there's an after party for those who still have any energy left.
Any energy left? Well, it's going to be a little cooler that day, so that should help. Well, all right, I just don't know where to begin. I think we should maybe, I'll ask Roger, I got to get these names straight here. Michael Carnosh.
Sure.
Want to get Michael, is that salmon bake, are they going to bake them there?
Not this time, they won't, but it is something that could be in the works for next year. This time, the tribe's donating smoked salmon, individually packaged, so families or individuals can come up and get their smoked salmon. Mm-hmm. It's been caught and cleaned and smoked and everything, packaged all by the tribe at the reservation, at the Grand Ronde Reservation. And the tribe is made up of over 27 different tribes and bands, including the Multnomah Chinook, who are the original inhabitants of that particular St. John's area. So it's going to be a really special day.
There's a plaque, I believe, right down there on the waterfront talking about the native tribes. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, I am, and there's a little bit of a hiccup on that plaque. It mentions the Calapuyans as the original inhabitants.
They're
which
further south.
Yeah, the Calapuyans did inhabit most of the Willamette Valley, but that's all south of Oregon City at Willamette Falls. The tribes of the lower Willamette and lower Columbia there are all Chinookan. They're all Multnomah, Clackamas, Cascades, Cathlamet, of all those types of tribes and bands. But other than that one error, it's neat to see that there is something there to commemorate the original inhabitants. And I want to let folks know that they are still out there. The descendants of the original inhabitants of the lower Willamette River are still alive. They're still thriving. They're still practicing their traditions.
I know that Chief Johnny Jackson, he's been on the program and done Native Nations. He's a Cascade.
Oh, that's great.
He's one of the 14 bands of the Yakima.
That's awesome.
So, there was a lot of intermingling of those tribes. And even though there's a lot of different languages involved, they could communicate very well.
Oh, yes.
Trade will do it.
yes, absolutely. Chinook Wawa is a language that, it's a true language, but it derived from the regional trade dialect of Chinook. So a lot of people really fluent in it, most of them children, thanks to the tribes' cultural and education departments teaching the children how to speak that again.
I see. Well, so I should be able to get this right this time. Here, Roger.
Yes, sir.
Roger Lindley.
How you doing,
So you're
Jim?
famous. You got on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. What have you been doing that makes you so famous?
Well, that was back in 2003. But in 1980, I started collecting memorabilia and books about Lewis and Clark. And it was it was a passion. It took over my life, and it was really fun. I mean, I worked hard in heavy construction, but every penny I earned went into buying books. I wanted every piece of literature ever written about Lewis and Clark. And I finally completed that in 1998. And my books now reside at the Watsik Library at Lewis and Clark College. And it's been a thrill. It's changed my life. That's all I do now is do research about Lewis and Clark and talk about it.
Well, you'd think you'd run out after a few years, but it just never ends.
There's always something new. There's always something new.
You say you collected and read and collected a bunch of different books, and then you wrote a bunch of different
Yes, I did. I actually wrote a book called Shotgun on My Chest, Memoirs of a Lewis and Clark Book Collector. They say, well, why is it Shotgun on My Chest? I said, well, I had a lot of money tied up in books in my home, over $500,000. And so I slept with a 12-gauge shotgun for a number of years, just in case. But we'll leave that go.
Well, I know before we move on, we've got a picture here. That's if we could pick this thing up, and if the person camera could zoom in on that, in this area right here mainly, and you could explain what that is. Because Barbara alluded to the fact that it was the lower Willamette.
Yeah, this sketch actually, it even says on the top of the map, it shows right on the very top where Clark wrote that this was a sketch that had been provided by the native Indians, the native peoples, on a mat made with chalk or charcoal, and then he copied it into his journal, and that's what this is. Where the arrow is shows where Clark camped on April 2nd. It was actually an abandoned home of native peoples who had gone up to the Oregon City Falls to fish.
Right, and I'll show everybody here. This here is the Columbia, and this is the Willamette going up here, and this is the lower Willamette. And you said he camped right there where that arrow is?
Right where the arrow is, and that's right at Terminal 4. And it's just about,
right.
The actual campsite is underneath a Toyota somewhere out there. And there's a gentleman there, Dr. Stephen McClure, who will tell us about that location that he's done a lot of research on.
He'll be telling us on the event.
Yeah, he'll be at the event taking a hike over to the area I kind of pointed out.
All right. Well, if folks out there that are really into history, and you're going to find out about the Willamette, you're going to find out about pollution, you're going to find out about history, and that to me, that when I was in school, I thought history was bunk, and then I realized a few years later that I was really, really into history. It's interesting. I kind of wish I kind of went down the same road with economics. I hold my nose at that, but now you can't understand what's going on in the world without a little bit of economics, and so it's good. We'll get back to that in a little bit, but the PDX Harbor Community Advisory Group. I know there's been a while they've been trying to clean that river up. In the 50s, I believe it was, the National Geographic had a spread on how polluted it was, and they cleaned it up. Now, was that polluted since then, or was that because of all the sediments were still in the way down deep in there?
Well, what we're dealing with now is mostly the sediments. Mostly the pollution that has happened historically and is still happening to some degree from the industry nearby, but it's the sediments we're talking about.
So are those the sediments that we saw, the brown pool that was around that ship?
Yeah, that ship really stepped on the gas, and
they reversed the engines, I think.
They did, and they unfortunately were going right by one of the sites that is very problematic, the Gasco
Ouch.
site, and some of our members were a little bit disturbed by how much they churned up the river there. Yeah.
And so that's what they're trying to do. Are they going to dredge that, or?
There's several different ways they have of addressing the problem of the sediments. Dredging is one thing that they can do. Another idea that they're going to be looking at is capping. So dredging and capping are kind of mostly the main ways of dealing with it.
What are they going to cap? They're going to just put cement over the bottom of it, like the LA River?
Well, that's a scary thought.
Yeah, I knew.
No, capping isn't quite like that. They don't actually put cement, but what they would do is they might put some active charcoal down there, and then they would probably load some sand and gravel on top of certain areas. And they have to be careful what areas they cap, because not all of the river is conducive to capping. The river scours in the spring, so that means
with the heavy currents.
That's right. And so it's not a very good river for capping. It's not a very good river for so-called monitored natural recovery, which is a method we community or advisory members don't think is very effective. It basically means leave it in place and watch it. The best alternative, we think, is dredging.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So who are the advisory group?
The advisors are members of the community representing various neighborhood associations in Northwest Portland, North Portland, and basically it's anybody in the community, any community.
It's not organizations then?
It's not really organizations necessarily. You have to be a citizen. Right, you can't be necessarily one of the businesses. It's a citizen group.
Because I understand that a lot of this is on the taxpayers, not too many of the corporations. Like what was it, the Chrome and the different organizations or the different businesses that created the problem aren't in the picture at all.
Well, we seem to be paying the ratepayers are paying for half of the feasibility study right now. That's up to about $52 million. So the citizens are definitely involved, and you can look at your water rates and you can see the Superfund is on the rates, so we're definitely involved. And how much of that money is going to actually be returned to us or not, I don't know, but
I see.
Yeah.
Well, Michael, being with the Grand Ronde, you folks probably have a whole different idea what that river should be like. And
Yeah.
you speak a little bit about what that portion of the river might have been like before Lewis and Clark sullied it up?
Well, it's kind of an interesting duality that goes on in the tribal government, because there is definitely the feeling, and it's very much justified, that the Willamette River was a beautiful place. It was a grocery store, a highway, and everything. It was life itself. And that has been very much ruined, poisoned, and otherwise sullied, as you say. But there's also a thought that just in its value as a place, as the place, of the lives, the collective lives of the various Chinookan bands that lived in that area, that energy and that specialness, that I can't quite put a word to it that really fits, but that is still very much alive and well. And it's that that I think people, just people in Portland, really should learn a little bit more about. It's just like on Roger's map here that he showed. There are so many native names. There's village names. There's different place names and things like that. And that's probably not even the half of it. Just in the Portland area and the streets, you know, the places that we go to every day, there were very particular places for certain things to happen. Some of them were fishing places. Some of them were for gathering plants or for hunting. But they all had names. And a lot of those names, surprisingly large number of those names survive today. So it still is a very special place. And that's kind of that duality that I talk about. But, you know, from the tribe's perspective, it's really, really important to get people involved in a cleanup that's adequately protective. And that's the big thing, is we want people to be able to use the river as people once did every single day for their lives and their livelihoods, without feeling fearful of eating or otherwise taking in poison.
You know, I've often made jokes about it because of the sewage, you know, and maybe I'll stop doing that because it is a sacred thing. But at the same time, you know, there are issues with it.
Yeah,
I remember seeing something on Channel 10 a while back. I was astounded. It showed what it looked like before all them buildings, and there's creeks and rivers coming off. There was little lakes and lagoons, not just the sloughs, all on the west side. It was completely different. It wasn't just that all those buildings were gone, and there was a lot more to it than that.
Yeah, absolutely. You're totally right, Jim. Especially on the west side of the river, but also on the east. It was not just a river channel kind of flowing through the area like a big canal. It was a really complicated, interconnected, interbraided system with, as you say, all kinds of lakes, little side creeks, waterfalls, and everything. And that's really what made the Chinookan people one of the wealthiest people in the entire North American continent. They were a very, very wealthy kind of sub-tribe of folks, and it's because of the richness of the place where they lived, which is now Portland, the lower Columbia, and the lower Willamette.
Well, sure, and they also, you know, they were in a very good position to trade with the tribes at the coast and the horse tribes from the east, and they had made, you know, Celilo was, I think, the oldest village possibly on the planet.
Yeah, absolutely.
Until we blew up
it was the original trade highway. Yeah, from since time immemorial.
So, well, we've heard a little bit about what the natives think about this. Now, you said that Lewis and Clark, Roger, that he camped there, and how long did he stay, and did he continue to like what he was doing, collecting samples of the flora and the fauna, and make notes and do all that? Did he really research this area?
Well, Jim,
and did he catch malaria?
No,
because I know there was issues with that here.
Well, there were, but that was not here with them. Basically, though, the exciting thing about the Willamette River is Lewis and Clark missed it as they were going west and as they were going east. And it wasn't until they got to Washougal where native people said, "Hey, you missed a big river."
Really?
Lewis and Clark actually thought the Sandy River, Quicksand River as they called it, was the river that drained the valley to the south. And so they hired a guide. The natives called him a cash hook, who resided up at the base of the Oregon City Falls. And actually he said that he lived, though, at a tribe, at a village over in Blue Lake Park, which actually Michael and I, about 15 years ago in Metro, made a nice memorial for the tribe over there, the Nakakles. And it's a west end of Blue Lake Park. So we worked together on this and the importance of the native peoples. But when they went down west and came back east, they passed the river because it was blocked by 3 islands that were covered by each other so they couldn't see between them. And then this guide, or pilot, as Clark said, brought him back up, and then these Indians sketched this map for him, and he says, whoa, he had no idea. But it was only Clark that came back. Lewis stayed over at the other camp. They were trying to get provisions. But it's exciting to think that, you know, and it was very, very friendly. But Wapato was the biggest trade item right here. It was a bulb arrowroot, grows on...
Like camas?
Yeah, it grows on Sauvie Island a lot. It was a major trade item. Wapato was, actually, more than fish and such. But what I would like to just mention is, briefly, that I grew up in North Portland, and as a kid back in the 1950s, I would go down along the Willamette River, swim in the river. My friends and I would build a raft and paddle around like Tom Sawyer. And we would swim in the lagoon behind Swan Island, which didn't used to be connected to the land. But that was a major outlet for the North Portland sewer. And when we would swim across the lagoon, the water was kind of a yellow-brown, and it had floating things on it. I won't mention that.
Or what they were.
It was horrible. And we got home, and we'd always have to shower immediately. You know, it was horrible stuff. But our family would still go down by the river a lot of times during the summer and have picnics. We'd have a small fire, and we'd have a stick and fish line and a hobo line, we'd call it. There was a big hobo camp back in Mock's Bottom, and we'd throw the line out and catch catfish, bottom fish.
Bottom fish.
And Dad would skin them right there. We'd roast them over the fire, and Mom would have something, and we'd sit there and skip rocks and just have a great time. It was a great family thing to do. We'd swim in the river. And I'm still here. I know there's been a lot of toxicity when I was a kid, and I would ride my bicycle below the university. Down there along the bottom, there was a place called, I think it was Baxter, McCormick was the...
McCormick Baxter.
McCormick,
Yeah.
I got it backwards. But there was puddles of creosote and toxic preservatives all over the place. And we'd drive our bicycles through this stuff, 3 or 4 inches deep, and like a big rain, but it was horrible. And I didn't realize it was going to become a part of a Superfund site when I grew up.
Well, all the more reason for people like Barbara to be joining these organizations and trying to do something about that. This has been going on for a long time. I remember a friend of mine, Joe Keating, was involved in it a while back. I don't know if he's still doing that, but it's been going on for a while. Are you making any headway?
Yeah, we are actually. It's been the Lower Willamette. This is what we're all three of us are talking about. Was declared a Superfund in 2000, and probably within the next year or two, we should be arriving to decisions about how the cleanup is going to proceed and who's going to pay for what. Well, that part might take a little bit longer, but in the next 2 years, EPA is going to make some decisions. It's coming up fast.
I was just going to ask that because the advisory group is advisory. They're not going to make that decision.
No, we don't really make the decision. We give input to the EPA and hope there's going to be a formal public comment period as part of the Superfund, and that's one of the reasons we're doing this event is to get people from the regular community involved in understanding and knowing the value of the Lower Willamette River, and also having an opportunity to give some feedback when the time comes. Yeah.
Would you give some more statistics about that event coming up?
Statistics?
August 2nd and...
Oh, yeah. It's August 2nd, Sunday, and there's going to be live music. There's going to be wonderful smoked salmon, traditional smoked salmon from the Grand Ronde tribe. It's complimentary. There will be food vendors. There will be cold drinks. There will be a beer garden supplied by Occidental Brewery. It's going to be right on the waterfront, so it'll be nice and cool, hopefully cooler than the rest of the city. And like I say, it's going to be wonderful. The children of George School are actually going to launch a boat that they hand-built as part of the festival, and they're going to launch it from the beach.
Is that like a native boat?
No, it's a wooden boat. It's a rowboat. I think they created 2 rowboats. Yeah, so they're going to launch that after Michael talks to us about the rituals and the Native American viewpoint of the river. So that should be a lot of fun. But we have some really good bands who sing bluegrass, folk, Americana.
All right.
Yeah.
All right.
And one thing I want to add real quick, if I can, is this event, celebrating the river, concern for the river, education about the river, and just being by the river is a lot different from some of the other riverside events or river-focused events that happen around Portland. This one, thanks to Barbara and the community advisory group and all of the folks there, they worked really, really hard at organizing this event at a grassroots level. There's no special interests. Nobody, you know, none of the PRPs are fronting up the cash to make this event happen. It all happened just through elbow grease and Barbara and other folks getting out there and spreading the word, and here and there just cobbling together stuff to put the event together. So it'll be a truly people's event for the people of the neighborhood and all of Portland and all of the region.
Mm-hmm. You know, I was just reading, I had a doctor's appointment today, and I was reading a National Geographic, and it was a story about from Turkey on south and how hurting those people are for water. And it seems to me that the Western cultures, even though those aren't Western cultures, the cultures of the planet that aren't indigenous necessarily, are coming around to the whole idea and understanding of the idea that water is sacred, which is a basic tenet of the Native Americans.
Yeah,
and that's what you were talking earlier. You were talking about it. There's a feeling about it, and I don't know, sacred, spiritual, or whatever. But it just seems to me that there is a connection there that it got lost. Because you know, I think of the Clackamas and on the rivers over there. There's smaller rivers. They have rapids, and they just seem like, you know, water. That just seems to me just to be a deep pool, like they say that the Columbia now is not a river, it's a series of lagoons or holding ponds. And that's something that I think you folks are trying to get away from people's perception, which is, I see now the assumptions that I've had along the way, that living right almost next to it, I really didn't recognize it for what it is.
Yeah, it's I think it's going to be a really great thing, and I'm seeing a lot more of it around the Portland area and just in the Northwest in like, you know, the last 5-6 years. People are recognizing what rivers once were and could be again, and are. I mean, it's there. The Willamette River is there. It is a sacred, special place. And it can, if enough people care about it and put their energy into it, like Roger and Barbara have been doing, it can be what it once was. It is possible.
Which is going to bring up my next question to Roger here. You know, you were mentioning swimming in it. Well, you know, I was raised around the Sacramento River, just south, downstream from the dam, and you know, we swam in that also. And I can remember so many swordtail salmons, and it was a whole different situation back then. But the water was coming out of the dam, and it was a big river at that point. But the Willamette doesn't have any dams on it. So it was always pretty much that size that it is now.
Yes and no. The area where we're going to be at, the Terminal 4 area, is basically, I'd say, about at least a couple hundred yards of infill dredging. It's been expanded, the area for industrialization. The river was wider below the St. John's Bridge during the time of Clark. And it's really interesting. They were only there one night. That was April 2nd of 1806 on the return trip. And he was exploring to see how big and how, if the river could handle large ships for commercialization.
Like they were coming up the Columbia ship that came up the Columbia River.
Exactly. And so he had a cord that was only 5 fathoms, a fathom being 6 feet, and he went down as far as he could, and he couldn't find bottom about where the St. John's Bridge is. They actually went a little bit south of the southeast of the St. John's Bridge, where it was wider, saying that it was about 500 yards wide. But that particular day, he couldn't really see. The Indians, or the native peoples, didn't draw or explain to him about Swan Island. And so it's not on the map sketch. But he couldn't see it, because that day he described the weather as being misty and very foggy, and as far as he could see is what he could see, and that's all he described. So he never went on Wadd's Bluff up at the university, which is unfortunate. But he couldn't see things, so he stayed on the river pretty much. But it was a bigger river, wider river, and a lot more trees along the edges of the river and such.
Right, and there was salmon runs probably.
And there were salmon runs, yeah, all over the place.
But they couldn't get past Willamette Falls, I would think.
The salmon could.
They could.
Oh yeah.
There's some
Yeah.
tough,
It wasn't
tough
that-
salmon in those days.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, they got past Siletz Falls, and that
That's
was
true.
a 20-foot drop.
That's true, but the Willamette Falls is pretty much more than that. Of course, during the spring, with the water running, it may not be as much.
Right.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. The spring run, they think historically could have made it up above the falls, and that actually corroborates with some creation stories that I can't go into them in detail, but
You will on Sunday, though.
I will talk about some of the stories
right.
and some of the special things, particular to the Willamette River in the creation stories, and they do talk about the spring Chinook being able to traverse the falls.
That was quite a job, and I've heard some of the stories from the Columbia. Forget the fellow's name right now. That I've heard a lot of his stories, and the stories about the Bridge of the Gods caving in because of rocks being thrown by two mountains at each other, and all. It's just the incredible stories, and that's all enough reason right there to go to the event. It's going to happen Sunday at 2:00.
Sunday
the
at
2nd.
noon. Sunday at noon.
Until 7, and then it's going to be quite an event, and you are speaking, and you are speaking as well, and you mentioned one other person that was speaking.
There's going to be some children. There's going to be children dancers in the Hispanic tradition, in the African tradition, and also we're going
the
to
Aztec dancers.
Yeah. That's right. And then there's also going to be local school children who, as I mentioned, had hand-built boats, are going to actually christen and launch them from the beach. So we're trying to get the next generation involved, the next generation thinking about their river, because this is our river. And what we're trying to do with this event is reframe this as the commons, as a community asset and something that belongs to everybody. And like Michael was saying, we should be able to fish, swim, and just like Roger, when Roger was growing up, picnicking, we should be able to do that. We should be able to do that again.
Well, it's good to see that, Roger, that you're healthy. You've got a couple years on you, though. But there are people that probably weren't. That
Probably
may have
not.
been more susceptible to some of those pollutants.
A couple of things I should mention too about the Lewis and Clark expedition. On the way back, they stopped right across on the Washington side, but they didn't see the river again, the Willamette River again, because it was blocked by islands that were there. But when they were standing there, Lewis was looking to the south and said, "I can see a mountain in the far distance." And then Clark said, "Yes, let's name that after President Jefferson." So they could see Mount Jefferson from basically the mouth of the Willamette River. Now, when Clark went up the river, he said, "I can see more mountains. I can see Mount Jefferson. I see Mount Hood. I can see another snow-capped mountain between Mount Hood and Mount St. Helens, but I don't know what that is. Oh, and I can see Mount Rainier from the mouth of the Willamette River." It's a rare day when you can see some of those.
You can barely see those from the 205 freeway up there when you're heading north. I mean, you just really got to be lucky to see just a little bit of Rainier sticking out below St. Helens.
But what Clark said from that spot, looking around, he was describing the landscape for the return and putting it in the journals. He said, "This is a wonderful place." He said, I believe this is competent to support a population of 40 to 50,000 people if properly cultivated. The hills are fertile, and it's gentle rolling hills, and it's the only place I think possible for settlement west of the Continental Divide. And here we are in Portland, Vancouver today.
You're right. But he didn't really have any idea what the Willamette Valley was all about.
He had no idea.
No clue.
Only what the natives said, and they said that it went, they thought the natives were suggesting it went all into the Californias. And on Clark's major map, it shows it going almost to Salt Lake.
Really?
Yeah, it really does.
Well, the maps in those days, they didn't have GPS, so
No.
a little bit. Now, we mentioned the lower Willamette, so how far up does the lower Willamette go?
Well,
To the falls?
The lower Willamette is considered everything up to Willamette Falls, and then above that is the mid Willamette, and then the upper Willamette up around Eugene. Yeah.
Well, as you said, that the tribes of the Grand Ronde were a lot of the tribes that were living in this lower, I guess, North Willamette Valley. Now, what relationship did the Siletz have to that?
The Siletz is made up of some of the same tribes. So the Siletz is made up of a lot of the coastal tribes, but also they also have Chinooks. They have Molalas as some of their tribal members as well.
I think they even had some of the Shasta. I believe I read somewhere that some of the Shastas were moved, and the Rogue, because they had some serious Indian wars down there because of whenever you had people looking for gold and finding gold, you had some serious discrimination and downright cruelty, and I think that they spread those out a lot because of that. But it's phenomenal that we could have this wonderful resource, and I know they just put a lot of money in so the sewages wouldn't back up during the heavy rains. So the city is somewhat paying attention to it.
Yeah.
And what does the city have to say about any of this? The cleanup that the advisory board is working on.
Well, we haven't heard a lot from the city level yet. We're still talking with our city leaders. We hope that we can have our city leaders understand that the river is more than just industry, that there's also communities that live on the river. The river has more meaning than just its economic role. And so we're still in the process of talking with city leaders. In fact, we would love to invite city leaders to this event. So
Have you?
We have. And we're
All
hoping to see maybe a city commissioner or two and state leaders perhaps.
Well, hopefully
Yeah.
the salmon will help them get there, because people love salmon. And where's the salmon being caught, by the way? It's not Columbia River salmon, probably.
Actually, I believe it is. Yeah, I believe it is from the Columbia River. Yeah.
Well, we've talked about the pollution, and I forget, you mentioned McCormick, and there was a lot of creosote, and there was chromium, and there was all different kinds of things along the river. But there's an awful lot of, I don't know what they call it, non-point pollution that's coming from all the agriculture. Is that figuring in on this at all?
Well, they're not really counting the pollution from runoff from the farms and agriculture from upriver so much as what they're considering non-point pollution is immediately adjacent to the Superfund area, which is only from the Fremont Bridge and the 11 miles down to the confluence. So they're only looking at the industry and the businesses and the entities along that section of river and what's going on with pollution from those sites. And it's DEQ's purview to make sure that the pollution from those sites no longer gets to the river. Yeah.
Gets to the Willamette River.
Gets to the Willamette River, right. So they're working on stormwater runoff, groundwater issues, and trying to make sure that pollution does not recontaminate the river once we clean it.
Which is what happened after the 50s. I don't know how much they cleaned it back then.
Yeah.
But I actually saw that one time. Someone had a copy of it, and it showed a picture of the Willamette River, and it didn't catch fire like whatever it was back east, Allegheny or whatever it was, but it was pretty bad.
It was bad. Yeah, it was bad. Now they're saying it's not so much the water column itself. The water column's not really bad. It's the sediments mainly. And where that gets problematic is that the small animals that live in the sediments are the basis of other life in the river. So the crawdads are eating the little critters that live in the mud, and then other animals are eating those little bugs, and the pollution is getting exponentially concentrated into
bioaccumulation.
That's it. Yeah, into the fish. And so it's very problematic when people fish and catch those bottom fish. And we have a lot of ethnic groups and subsistence fishers on the lower Willamette River that fish real regularly there. So
And eat real regularly.
they
there.
do, yeah, they do. Mm-hmm. So
And so that is a problem. And they fish in
problem.
the sloughs as well, and that is really problematical.
it's a problem, and it's a cultural thing. You know, we warn them about pollutants, but some of the ethnic folks prefer those fish, and it's a cultural thing and a family tradition to fish in those places for those particular fish, and so it's hard for us to influence how they
Sure.
fish.
Well, if it made them sick immediately, it might be another issue, but it makes
Yeah.
them sick down the road, or the
Yeah.
next generation gets sick
Yeah,
from it.
yeah.
So,
So-
well, now that we're mentioning indigenous people, Roger, I'm wondering, what was Lewis and Clark's relationship with the native peoples? I know he picked up, Sacagawea, and he had different native guides along the way, and did he have a good relationship with the natives here?
The expedition had an excellent relationship with the peoples around here, the native peoples. In fact, it was the native peoples who told them about the Willamette River, or
Right.
they would not have seen it.
Right, they
It
wouldn't
was
have laid them
native
on
peoples when the expedition got back to a place today called William Clark Park at Washougal. And they were there. They were only going to stay overnight. But the native peoples coming downstream in their canoes came in and said, "Don't go further. Everybody's starving. The fish have not arrived yet." This was first part of April. It's interesting, too, that the salmon runs 200 years ago are the same today. But anyway,
What do you think about that, huh?
yeah, but the salmon hadn't arrived yet. There were no deer or elk or anything as you got further into the dry area above the Dalles. And everybody's starving, and they had to stay there, and they had to get some provisions before they would proceed on. And fortunately, that was good, because then that's when they learned about the Willamette River.
And they went
And
back,
Clark
yeah.
wanted to come back and explore it and see how deep it was and see what was there. And so he had the help there, and then, of course, the tribe of the pilot was living at Blue Lake Park. They were very helpful, although there was only one lodge there at the time, and there were 5 other lodges that were collapsed. And Clark said, "What happened to all the people?" And similar to what the coastal Indians, the Clatsop and the Chinooks said about 30 years before their arrival, there was a deadly disease, it was smallpox, brought forth a woman to show that her face was all pock, but she had survived.
I understand that came with the Columbia ship. At least that's what I've heard.
Most likely on a ship. But yeah, the tribal people were very, very kind, shared their food everywhere. They shared their food, they shared guides, they shared, their information, their knowledge. This was their home. And they welcomed these white people into their home and helped them everywhere they could.
We always think about the first I guess Plymouth, Massachusetts or whatever, when the folks came over here and they were starving in the winter, and the natives fed them. I guess there really wasn't wild turkey on the table, but they fed them. But this happened time and time again. Perhaps the English and whatever, the Dutch would have settled this country eventually, but they would have lost a whole lot more people, and it would have been a whole different story. But story after story as they crossed, Lewis Clark especially, I think at the Mandans they saved them from almost being starving to death, and as they came across, they were given horses and help by the Nez Perce. I mean, that story, just as you mentioned, he just keeps being repeating. I see Michael shaking his head. You're familiar with that?
Yeah, it's a real common cultural tradition, and I'm sure it's true of indigenous peoples around the world, but you especially see it in North America. The tradition of when somebody's visiting your homeland, it's on you. It's your honor to be a good host and to make sure that they're being taken care of, and that they get everything they need. And part of the thought is to impress your guests with how rich you are. You can afford to put them up and feed them and keep them very well. But part of it too is it's just that honorable thing. It's the tradition of welcome to our home. This is our home. We want to give you some food. We want to make you comfortable. We want to make you happy to be here, and that's part of the reason. Actually, it's all of the reason why the Grand Ronde Tribe is providing the smoked salmon at the event on Sunday.
Of course, yeah.
Because that's Grand Ronde's treaty homelands. They signed the Willamette Valley Treaty of January 22nd, 1855, ceded the title to that land to the United States, but the tribe retained some rights on that land.
Well, that's what reservation means. You know, we reserve this for ourselves. We'll trade this off.
It's really a very generous gesture by the tribe to share salmon with us. In fact, when I first started talking to Michael and we started discussing a salmon bake, I had no idea that the free will offering of the salmon would be part of it. And we were discussing with him how much we would charge and, you know, how we would do that. And he said, oh no, there will be no charge. And so this is really, we're really partaking of an ancient tradition here, and I think it's really something that people should see the specialness of that.
Sure. I've been to up on the gorge. There's salmon, and then there's venison, and also maybe some kind of things with the huckleberries and the pemmican, I think they call it. There's a, I know like John Trudell, who's a Native American spoken word artist, says we all come from tribes, meaning people from Europe. And on my Italian grandmother, you know, manja, you know, people showed up and they stuck food in your face. I mean, that's European tradition too, you know, and it goes back.
Yeah.
And I'm glad to see that that's an integral part of this particular one, which is happening when?
It's happening Sunday. It's happening Sunday, and if you're interested in smoked salmon, be sure to be there at noon, because we'll have a lot. We're going to have a lot of fish there, but it's a good idea to get there at noon. Yeah, and it goes until 7, so you'll have plenty. There will be plenty of other things to do, and there will be other food available, and so come and enjoy.
And so the speakers are going to be, you're going to be one of the speakers, Michael, and you have a particular theme? Are you just going to be like going over like what we've talked about, or do you have more of a specific presentation? It's going to be me talking, so I'm not going to have any visuals or anything like that, but I am going to go into a little bit more detail about the river and places on the river specifically, so people can understand. As you know, Roger and Barbara, it takes no effort at all. They are dialed into just how special this place is. But I think a lot of people out there, it does seem, when you look at the Willamette River, like it's just kind of a big blob of water that, you know, makes me have to take a bridge to get to where I want to go, and it's kind of a pain, and it's in the way. And that's really not the case at all. And I'm hoping to, maybe get a few folks interested in just how special the river is, and just how important a part of everyday life it is. You know, I know the feeling, and you know, like I live in Southeast, and I see the Johnson Creek, and that is, you know, that's nothing like it was at one time. But it is starting to come back, and I get the same feeling like on the Columbia, like I mentioned, it's just a series of holding ponds now. But at one time, you know, if anybody's ever seen any photographs of the original area of Siletz Fall, it was a phenomenal thing. And did Lewis and Clark, did they boat or take horses around that, or did they go down it with rafts, or how did they negotiate that?
Well,
because that is way beyond a number 10 or whatever it is.
Class 6.
Lewis and Clark had horses to get over the Rockies and the Bitterroot Mountains. They left their horses in the trust of the Nez Perce, who they say were the friendliest, most important people, you know, the natives that they encountered going across the country. But so they had horses there, but left the horses there. And then when they got down about Orofino, the native peoples actually showed them how to build canoes. The men of the expedition were using adzes and axes and everything, and the natives said, no, just light a fire on the log and put a little water along the side and form it with fire. And they showed them how to do it, and it was very easy. So they made 5 canoes, and then the Nez Perce actually said, well, here, we've got a father and his son, and they will guide you down the river so you don't hit any bad rocks and things. And they will lead them all the way to the mouth of the Snake River. And then they had these other guides on horses that would go along shore and meet tribes along the way in advance and say, there's good people coming, do them no harm. And so it was an amazing thing. And so they had horses until they were at the Nez Perce, and then they had boats all the way down. And on the return, they had traded their dugout canoes, which weighed about a ton each.
And they were made from a log.
Oh yeah, they're just a 30-foot log.
It's not like a bridge canoe of the tribes up there in the Great Lakes.
The lower Columbia people, the Chinooks and the Clatsop, and I'm sure people around this area, made their canoes out of cedar trees, and they were very light. A 30-foot canoe, which I've picked up before, 6 men can pick it up, weighs about 300 pounds, and you can pack it overland. The dugout canoes Lewis and Clark had was a whole different story. When they got to the Celilo Falls coming west, they had to lower the canoes with cords on the Oregon side down 20 feet, and then they had to pack all their materials along the Washington side where it was a little level until they got down below the falls. And then they came to a place called the Long Narrows, which was 2.5 miles long, and it was terrible. And Clark said it was only about 50 yards wide at one spot and 150 yards other, and all this water rushing through this. So they took all their stuff out of the canoes. The Indians, the native peoples, lined the shore, Clark said, to watch the event, thinking that they would crash and burn, and the native peoples would get the canoes and all their stuff. But their watermen got through real well, and they continued on down.
Well, they had a years of experience of doing that. It was incredible. I mean, people today are tough, but I think about the people taking off in a wooden ship. Think about Columbus what you will, and I don't think a lot of them. But folks in those days taking off across that ocean, or Lewis and Clark taking off across this country, not knowing a damn thing about it. Incredible. It's just astounded that the people, and they pulled it off so well. I mean, they explored and they sent back, like I was saying earlier, the flora and the fauna. Do you know much about all of that, the collections that they did?
Well, they had 178 plants, 122 animals that they described, and it was an incredible thing. And of course, as Jefferson had said, to take the longitude and latitude of every mouth of every stream and describe all the... I can't imagine being on that expedition, being a frontiersman, and having to do everything they had to write in a small given amount of time. Clark even wrote one time in the journals, one man hurt his shoulder and he says, I really can't get into this because we have a small amount of time and a small amount of paper with which to record the important facts. So we will forego this.
Well, how did they take longitude and latitude? Did they have a sextant or whatever?
They had sextant, octant, compass, and then
they had horses.
Well, basically, Clark used dead reckoning, which was you use what instruments you had, and then use your basic good judgment as to where you've been and how far it looks you're going to go, and just dead reckoning. It's an old method of navigation. And that's what he was using, and it was pretty accurate, really. He was quite good. His maps were absolutely incredible. Now, this wasn't his map, but he copied it. But his maps were just incredible. I think there's something said that when they were coming across the country, and those 4,134 miles going west, and that it was only off maybe about 60 miles in actuality, because people have followed and done it with current instruments and things and GPSs and such. Sure. And just incredible how good they were.
It's incredible how smart people can be. I've read that some of the folks, the islanders, they can be 50 miles out to shore, and they know how far that island is just by the way the water is flowing back from it. Things like that. Incredible. That such fine-tuned senses that we lose a lot of that with all of our fancy equipment these days.
Oh, it was incredible. I've studied a lot of the Pacific voyages as well because of my interest in Lewis and Clark, so I've expanded. And like you're saying, of the Polynesians, they could look at the water, they could look at the air, they could look at the clouds. If in a distance they would see a cloud, there must be an island there.
Because it holds the moisture.
Yeah, and different types of birds. They would know how far birds would go searching for food. and then sometimes they would follow the birds, where they were flying,
Depending on what kind of birds they were.
depending on what
Yeah.
kind of birds they were.
Sure. Well, and I think that Michael might have a few little places where he's plugged into the earth, and your people over there, like what we're saying here.
Yeah, it's very, very true. If you pay attention and you know how, the earth will tell you how to make your living. It will tell you where the good fish and the good plants can be found. You have to listen and listen in the right way.
Sure. What's that quote from Chief Joseph? Man comes from the earth, not earth from the man. Some quote like that shows that we don't have lords over it, in spite of what the Bible says. That we're all interconnected. Whether it's in the Mideast or we're here or Lewis and Clark coming across. It was really a shame to find out that was it Lewis that ended up dying.
Yes.
It was a shame that that all ended up that way, but they did a phenomenal thing when they came over here, and I can understand why some people such as yourself can be just so taken with that you would just focus your whole life through that. And as you say, how did you put it a little while ago? It enlivened you, or it made your life, or
It changed my life.
changed your life. That was it.
And there's a great quote years ago in Walden's Pond where he said, "Books change lives." When I said that, when I saw that, when I read it, wow, that's true. But it's very interesting, how things can change your life, and it certainly did mine, and it increased my knowledge and interest in America, and in our area too, as well. But the native peoples, what I like to tell people is, when you go to the original journals of Lewis and Clark, not Undaunted Courage or some of the other books written about the expedition, but if you go to the real journals, study the journals. Don't read them. These are logs, they're diaries of frontiersmen. And they're putting in everything they can, and as Clark stated, we put every word in, every letter, to make sure the sound was right for the native languages. And it's the stories within the story that really are fascinating.
Well, we got about right around a minute and a half. So, Michael, anything you want to sum up this?
Sure. I just want to really encourage people to come out to Cathedral Park on Sunday at noon. There will be free smoked salmon for folks that show up, and just want to underline how special this place is. Since time immemorial, it has really been a good place for people to live and prosper.
And that statistics of the event are?
Once again, it's on Sunday, August 2nd. It's from noon to 7, and it's the Willamette River Revival. And there will be live music. We have 4 bands, and mostly Americana, but we also have a hip-hop artist from the East Coast. His name's Decora, and so that'll be very fun.
All right. And I want to encourage people that to show up there and make a connection. We've talked about connection to the earth, connection to the Lewis and Clark, a connection to the different aspects of what we've been talking about. And this river needs to be cleaned up, and it's only going to be cleaned up with public pressure.
That's true.
As like look behind us. It's fitting that that's there because there's no pollution necessarily in the Arctic, but the folks that are out there don't want there to be pollution. There's nobody to stop it but the people, just like there's nobody to stop it and clean it up in the Willamette.